Hello everyone, my name's Zenitsu and I'm back with another Digimon video. So today I'm going to be taking a look at the competitive season of 2023 in review. So I'm going to be going over each of the different sets that were released and the metas that accompanied each different set as the game continues to change and evolve over time. Before I get into the more nitty-gritty meta stuff, I do have some not meta stuff that I do kind of want to highlight that happened for Digimon in 2023. So we did have Digimon Con of 2023, and I personally feel like it was kind of a joke, holding almost no relevant information for basically any facet of the IP. The only thing that was really highlighted was the fact that there was the O2 movie, which was kind of nice, but in terms of TCG in video game space, we got basically next to nothing, which is slightly unfortunate, especially since Digimon Con is supposed to be celebrating and highlighting the Digimon IP, which I do appreciate because I feel like Bandai doesn't do enough with the IP to begin with. So I didn't also pay a whole lot of attention to Digimon Seekers. Digimon Seekers was like the big year-long thing, being a web novel of sorts, but the chapters came out too slow and it was machine translated, so it just completely lost interest to me after the first couple of chapters. I know it's almost finished or it's nearing its end at this point, at least I think it is. Again, I didn't really check up on it, but it seems like once it's all done, I'll probably go back and look at it now that, I could actually look at all of it instead of a drip feed of content, like it was an anime, except it wasn't an anime. But we also did get the Liberators announcement, which does look more interesting and more promising in terms of a new story. Then we also had the O2 movie, which wasn't a high-action spectacle, but it was a pretty decent movie, having a more darker, emotional, character-driven, and lore-heavy focus, which wasn't a bad thing in my perspective. But with all of the not exactly TCG stuff out of the way, let's go over what exactly happened in the competitive season of 2023, starting with technically the 2022 Nationals. So 2022 was the BT11 format, and this was BT11 without any restrictions. We didn't have exactly a whole lot of time in pure BT11, no restrictions, but the time that we did have in it, it was Greymon dominated, more specifically Black War Greymon X, as he just came out of that set, being one of the best, if not the best and premier control deck in the game. So Black War Greymon X did end up winning the North American Nationals, even though Shoutmon Cross 7 ended up winning Worlds. After this event, BT11 Greymon X was limited to put Black War Greymon X in check, as it was dominating the current metagame by a wide margin. Which brings us to post-BT11 Nationals, which was a more wider format, and a single deck exactly wasn't hyper-dominant. So after the limitations, the format opened up quite a lot, having 23 competitive meta decks, whereas before we only had 13. Granted, we did have more time post-Nationals and post-limitation than with limitation, but regardless, the fact that we had this diverse of a spread is definitely nice to see, showing that there's still lots of viable decks that are playable when one deck isn't overly dominating. You could kind of say that Cross Hearts was dominating because it did have two of the top slots, but they were kind of different in terms of how they played, where Cross Merva was more of an aggressive style of deck, and Cross 7 was more of a tempo style of deck, utilizing some slightly different tools, but the same core or foundation, similar to how Black War Greymon and War Greymon work. But going into BT12, it was another format that was mostly dominated by one or two decks, and then everything else kind of was just trying its best to be able to keep up. The top deck of BT12 was Beelzemon, so we did have the Beelzemon Advanced deck release right before BT12 in BT11, but with the support of BT12 actually accelerating the deck and making it better, it took the meta by storm, as it was not only an easy deck to build, it was a really powerful deck with all of its new tools and inclusions. Hunters was also an incredibly strong deck just because it came out with BT12. It was another deck that was really easy to build just because all of the cards were in BT12, so it just made the accessibility a lot higher, and I also feel like that's what contributed to Beelzemon's success was the accessibility because of the advanced deck, on top of just them being two of the strongest decks overall. But because these two decks were more dominant, it really restricted what was going to be played in the meta, and we only had 14 total decks viable in the meta as a result, because Beelzemon and Hunters were warping the speed and power around what those decks can do, and if you couldn't keep up or get lucky, then you just couldn't really win or perform very well. Which leads us into EX4. So EX4 was kind of a short format. We did get some new limitations post BT12, which was limiting Blossomon to 1, limiting EX2 Impmon to 1, limiting the promo Wergarurumon to 1, and limiting the Grand Kawagamon promo to 1. So the limitations did have an impact on the format as a whole, but we only had 12 decks top, and Black War Greymon was going back to being one of the best decks of the format, not necessarily by an overly dominating margin, but by a decent margin nonetheless, as one of the more prominent ones that's able to recursively top. Just as a little side note with this set and this format, this was the format that I actually was able to get my invite before they changed how invites work to Nationals utilizing red hybrids. So I do contribute a lot of my success to the fact that a lot of people were kind of just bored with this format, knowing it was going to be a super short format. So I used that opportunity to try to make a really good meta call, and well, it worked out in my favor with the matchups that I was able to see in the event I ended up topping in. Which now leads us into BT13. So BT13 was this year's longest format. I think this was literally one of the longest formats that we had in competitive Digimon history. It felt extra long just because it was technically touching 5 months, even though it realistically was only about 4 months. But regardless, the fact that it was actually a pretty decent format was definitely something that was nice to see. Even though Full Power Shine Greymon was the top deck, it wasn't overly dominating, and between all of the different events, we had a total of 22 decks able to top, which is definitely nice to see. A lot of old and new decks able to have some competitive success. It seems like when formats are long enough and a deck doesn't reach above 30%, usually we get a nice wide spread in terms of decks that are able to top and strategies able to perform well. Which now leads us into BT14 and the end of the year. BT14, I think, is one of the best sets in Digimon history, just because it was, well, not really warping or changing the game all too much. So it was a really decent set that acted like a great equalizer, having lots of cards to update current and existing decks, while also introducing a couple of promos that helped the speed and consistency of stack-based decks, which were struggling at the time, compared to hybrid-based decks and non-traditional based decks. So these new training cards are going to be a staple, along with the idea of resource gaining rookies, which helped speed up the decks, allowing more decks to be able to perform as a result, just because, well, that was the great equalizing tools that stack-based decks seemed to need. We also did get a couple of new bans and restrictions, which was a limitation to Gabumon from BT2, Gabumon from Starter Deck 6, Greymon from BT13, Mach Galgamon from EX4, Eismon Scatter Mode from BT7, Tommy Himi was unrestricted, and Savior Huck from BT6 was also unrestricted, which did have an impact on the format overall. So this ban and restriction list was really divisive, considering the nature on the reasons why cards were getting limited wasn't necessarily for the current format, it was for the Japanese format, which is a couple of sets ahead, especially since a lot of these limitations really was trying to hurt and restrict the color of purple, which in Japan was overly dominating, and currently, because we're not up to where Japan was, wasn't necessarily overly dominating for us at the moment. But overall, I feel like it made the game better as a result. So if you wanted to look and dig deeper into each of the specific formats, I should or do have videos covering each of these metas more specifically. But as BT14 brings a close on the year of 2023, we still have some things to think about and look forward to going into 2024, like Nationals. So usually a competitive season is from Nationals to Nationals, so we do have to talk about Nationals a little bit, and we did get one more ban and restriction that's going to be taking in effect after Nationals. So usually they do have a ban and restriction list that comes out after Nationals, usually as a result of Nationals, just to try to balance the game a little bit more, knowing what's going to be good because of what was able to perform at Nationals level on top of the Japanese data. So we did have Bukamon from BT14 get limited. We had Gabumon X from EX5 get limited. Gurumon X from EX5 get limited. Anubismon from EX5 also getting limited. And Apocalypmon from BT15 being limited, again, having some more firsts. So last ban and restriction list, we had our first unrestrictions, and this ban and restriction list, we had our first high rarity restrictions on top of our first egg being restricted, which I think we're getting to a point where that's kind of just going to be necessary, just because certain cards are going to be too powerful, rarity and card type aside. So Nationals is going to be an in-person event hosted in the Los Angeles Convention Center in California, just like last year. This time PPG is going to be running the event instead of Core TCG, and they did change how Nationals functions, making it where you don't necessarily need an invite to be able to participate, and instead you're going to be fighting for buys. So the buy structure allows you to get a 2-round buy, which might not seem like a big deal, but when you're going to be playing like 11 or 12 rounds, that 2-round buy actually can be a big deal. So that is definitely a welcome change, just because they're opening up Nationals to be able to be played by more than just whoever topped regionals, which makes it more of a celebration than last time. But last time we did have invites go into store championships, which put more value onto store championships. So it just kind of made Nationals and how you get there a little bit easier, but maybe not necessarily as rewarding, especially on the store level, because it did kind of seem like it hurt store championships a little bit, putting less meaning and less emphasis on them. But regardless, I'm not necessarily opposed to this change, just because now you can still play at that high competitive event without needing to grind all the way up to get your invite, which can be a little bit taxing on being able to get there. But the fact that EX5 is going to be the Nationals format, and we're not necessarily going to have these bans and restrictions, is going to make it a really interesting format, especially since we also got a choice ban, which was another first for the game, which means that if you're running one specific card, it can't be played in combination with others. We don't have a current English announcement for this yet, but I do think that having choice bans is also going to be needed, just because you don't necessarily want to kill a card that's meaningful for a specific deck and have that deck be unplayable just because someone else somewhere else found a really degenerate combination to be able to abuse the cards with. So, looking at all of these different metas, there are some trends that we should take note of. So, the wider the format is usually meaning it's a healthier format overall, and in turn is going to be, well, more liked and more received. So, to get to a wider format, obviously the power gap between all of the top decks needs to not be so high. Or if they are high, just all on the same level. So, the more one deck tends to perform or overperform, the more closed the format seems to get. Usually when a deck reaches that 30% or above threshold is when it becomes harder for more than around 15 decks to be able to get top slots. 15 decks still seems like it's a pretty high number, but compared to the other formats where we have like 22, 23, 24 different decks, it is more open and more inviting on top of the other decks that are still able to perform, but just haven't made a top slot yet. Having that one condensed deck or that two condensed deck really closes the format up, making it harder for multiple different decks to be able to top. So I do think that a lot of these bans and restrictions that they made over the year was a lot, but it ultimately made the game healthier and better each time, and having more diversity come in terms of the decks being played as a result. Yes, I do understand mistakes happen, but the important thing is to learn from those mistakes and make sure those mistakes don't happen again. Bandai's not necessarily the best at that, but hopefully they'll start to get the picture. Bandai also has this weird feast and famine release schedule in terms of the metas and how long we're in them, as BT sets and EX sets are on completely different release cycles, which I personally find to be extremely annoying. So EX sets release every 6 months from each other, while BT sets release every 3 months for each other. And then there's that obvious overlap where it doesn't exactly line up super nicely, and that's where we get that feast or famine, and it doesn't look like that's going to be changing anytime soon. RB sets add another set into the mix, which only makes the release schedules of their sets kind of more wonky, which I'm not necessarily a huge fan of, and they really should just look at all of the sets that they have and make it on one release cycle, and just time each of the different sets individually. Spreading them on average about 2 months apart is what I personally would do. So the one thing that we also need to acknowledge when it comes to the sets themselves is never mess with the rares. Whenever Bandai has ever messed with the rares, it always makes the set feel scuffed and feel bad to pull on, just because pull rates are going to be worse than the expected pull rates that we're used to. So Bandai did this with 2 different sets this year, and one of them was BT11 with campaign rares, and the other was RB1, while being RB1. So before I get into my overall year-end wrap-up, we do have Ultimate Cups to talk about. So Ultimate Cups, they had a year-long prizing, which was going to be the Gallantmon and Guilmon evolutionary line, which is what you can see above. So this year we did have a change to the rule set, so where it was a monocolored format. So a deck can only consist of cards that matched what the Digitama was, so this really limited the overall decks that were competitively viable, because we did have a lot of decks that used multiple different colors. So the reception because of this was fairly mixed, because not everyone has multiple different decks. So people who invested in something like Hunters or something like Crosshearts, they could not play those decks in Ultimate Cup, which might have been the only deck that they actually had. So there was some pros to it, just because it was a slight twist on what the normal experience of Digimon was, but it did, as a result, limit what decks were viable, and the meta became kind of predictable as to what would actually be good, because you would just look at what the competitive landscape was, remove all of the decks that were utilizing multiple different colors, and, well, boom, you just play with the best of what is left, and that kind of just was the meta. So the last few Ultimate Cups, they did decide to change the rules to make it a more of a select card pool, kind of mimicking block or a rotation, starting with RB1, going all the way up to what was in BT14 as to the cards that were legal. The reception to this Ultimate Cup was overwhelmingly negative, as it had the worst attendance records in recent Digimon history, which nobody really cared about this rule set, leading to one of the worst and more predictable formats that we've played in Ultimate Cup. It also didn't help with this style of Ultimate Cup being at the end of the year, which is towards holiday season, so people might not have actually had the money to want to spend on competing in Digimon, especially since the prizing was still the Guilmon prizing, and that hasn't changed for the whole year, which they had a lot of Ultimate Cups. The only thing that changed was the event packs, and that was kind of it. So 2023 was quite a wild ride. I'm excited to go to Nationals after getting my invite, which turned into a bye. But regardless of my overall performance, it was a really awkward year, I'd say, for Digimon nonetheless. Nothing was really consistent when it came to how the game was being ran and managed this year, as things constantly changed and the events were paced and spread out really awkwardly this time as well. Nothing felt concrete, leaving a lot to be desired for the competitive community. Meta-wise, I think we actually had some of the better metas in the game as far as what I've played and experienced, which was pretty much everything all the way from the start of the game. So I'd say anytime a meta reaches 20 plus decks that are playable and viable, it's always a win in my book, showing how healthy the game actually is, having a nice strong diversity of not only decks but strategies to have their time to shine and perform and do well, especially since it rewards a lot of creative players utilizing not necessarily the most known meta decks, being able to take those decks and perform very well with them. So the game did seem to have a solid amount of growth this year, having new ways to be able to draw in players, making it easier for them to be able to start. So between advanced decks and just better designed starter decks overall, along with a reprint set, regardless of how we all feel about it, and more sets containing some self-contained decks, and their overall change to how block design works with Block 2 and Block 3, it seemed like it was just a good way to be able to make the game even more accessible than ever before, having more ways to be able to start the game and easy paths to follow to upgrade the decks that you're currently interested or invested in. RB01, in my personal opinion, I feel like was the only real disaster of the entire year, mostly due to its overall reception on its story. Again, I have a whole separate YouTube video covering that, and its poor pull rates. But I'd say almost every other set was actually really decent. The only things that I can kind of complain about is BT11's campaign rares, making the BT11 rares kind of scuffed and making them actually harder to pull for, on top of EX4 and when it came out being a drastically underpowered set released between two powerhouse sets. So let's just hope that Bandai keeps this more positive trend going that they had towards the later half of the year, and let's hope that Bandai makes it so that in 2024 we have a better year than in 2023. So on that note, I want to wish everyone a happy new year, and I hope to see all of you in 2024.